Right. Dr. Nathan Hawkins, welcome to Solicited Advice.
Thank you for having me, Joe.
No, so it's an absolute pleasure. We're going to talk a lot about free will. Now, free will is one of those debates that really captures the public imagination, but I often think that a lot of the time we talk past one another to an incredible extent when it comes to free will debate. So I think we'd all appreciate just a little bit of outlining the different positions in the literature here. What are the different things that people believe in the free will debate, and what do those positions consist of?
Okay, great. Yes, I think that'd be helpful. So I think standardly, positions are sort of divided into three sorts of main positions. One would be that we don't have free will at all. There is no free will. And then a second would be that we do have free will of a sort that means that we are both the source of our actions and that there were genuinely alternative metaphysical possibilities ahead of us that we could choose between. That would be the libertarian conception of free will. And then there's another view of free will called compatibilism, which is the view that we don't have genuine, real alternative courses of action ahead of us, but that's not what's relevant for free will. Free will is something to do with the way in which what occurs in the world aligns with our wants, desires, and purposes, and so on. So typically then, those that deny we have free will want to say that whatever it is the compatibilist is talking about as free will isn't genuine free will. And so what tends to happen is those that deny we have free will and the libertarian conception of free will agree on what the nature of free will is. So they agree that it involves, roughly speaking, two aspects. This aspect of being the source of our actions or being the instigator of our actions or choices, and that it requires there to be alternative possibilities. Whereas the compatibilist thinks that the need for alternative possibilities isn't required for free will. Now, they can be open about whether there are or are not genuine alternative possible causes for action, but they don't think that is relevant to the question of whether or not we're free. So that's where it often comes down to this issue that's sometimes called determinism or causal determinism, which is the idea that somehow the future is already determined by maybe the past and the laws or something of that sort, so that those alternatives are not available.
Brilliant. So I've kind of got two questions going on here. One is everything determined or not? And the second question is, do you have a definition of free will that is compatible with a determined universe? So in theory, something brought up there, which I think is quite important, is that somebody can think that determinism is true, yet nonetheless have a version of free will that is compatible with that determinism. And also determinists and, philosophical libertarians are agreeing on what the definition of free will is, but the determinist simply says, or the incompatibilist determinist simply says, that definition doesn't map onto any object in the world. There is no thing that fulfills that definition.
Yes, and actually I probably should add in another consideration here, which I maybe should have mentioned earlier. There's sometimes a difference between sort of a hard incompatibilism and merely an incompatibilism with determinism. A hard incompatibilist position is that free will is not compatible even within determinism either. So the idea would be even if the world is not entirely determined, as many sort of ways of interpreting quantum mechanics would say, they think that still nevertheless makes free will impossible. Now that tends to be just sort of an argument at the conceptual level, which is the idea that the notion of free will requires things that are incoherent together, that it requires both on the one hand that we could have done otherwise, but also on the other hand that what we did sort of flowed from something else previously. So the idea is to have free will, things have to be both caused and not caused. And so that's impossible. So either way, you either have randomness, perhaps that's what some people assume indeterminism means, or you have something determined, and either way you can't be free. So that's sort of, I think, more of a conceptual complaint about free will.
And you yourself are a libertarian. So you think that there is a strong notion of free will wherein we could have done otherwise, and also we are the source of our actions. What brought you to that position?
I think that's always a funny question to ask a philosopher. I think what brought you to that position. There's so many different things you could answer. I mean, I could pretend that it's entirely rational, that I've considered all the evidence impartially, and it just seemed like most reasonable. But that doesn't tend to be the way people come to decisions. I think for me, the notion of free will is tied up with so many other ways in which we make sense of the world. I honestly don't understand how you could genuinely make sense of anything, certainly not make sense of your everyday life, or even sort of philosophically give an account for all the things that are important to us, if we didn't hold on to some sort of notion of agency. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean I would have to be a libertarian. I think that compatibilism gives you most of that. However, I do think there is something else about free will that sort of, in addition to it, so it's almost as though the decisions you do make a difference to the world. And I think that maybe that is what's lacking from the compatibilist account, that really nothing you do makes a difference to the world particularly. The world is just sort of going on its merry way. So I think I had that sort of deep intuition that things matter in terms of not just our own life, but also in terms of the world and everything else. And then when I really looked at it, there didn't really seem to be I don't think there's any really good arguments against some form of libertarian free will, unless you adopt a whole lot of metaphysical positions that never really struck me as that convincing anyway. So we might get on some of those. I mean, I think that it's very, very difficult to sort of isolate free will as though it's independent of everything else in terms of how you make sense of everything else. So one of those areas is whether we assume that, for example, physics is the queen of the sciences, and that any knowledge that's not knowledge derived from physics is not knowledge at all, which is sort of a physicalist way of interpreting the world. I'm not a physicalist. And so many of the arguments that sort of assume things like physical closure or sort of bottom-up causation only, that the particles do their thing and everything else just sort of dances along to it. I've never had that kind of conception of reality, and I've never seen sort of the draw for it. And so many of those sorts of arguments didn't really bite anyway. Now, that's only the start of things. Then you have to try and make sense of your position. So there's that side. And some of that, I suppose, is part of this idea that I've always taken free will to be a datum that requires explanation. It's so much a part of the way in which we think, behave, live, experience the world. We have to find some way of making sense of it. And so I think some ways that sort of just rules out the no free will move. In the same way, for me, so many theories in ethics are just ruled out from the bottom floor as well. If they say there is no such thing as right and wrong or something of that sort, they're just so deeply foreign. I don't think they hold much bite. That said, I don't think you need to have the kind of metaphysical view I do to think libertarian free will is coherent or even compelling. So we might talk about some of his work. I'm just starting to get familiar with it, but there's somebody at Cambridge at the moment called Peter Tse, who's written a couple of really good books with Oxford University Press a couple of years ago. Now, he is a physicalist, so he doesn't think there is anything that's more than described in the world of physics, but he is also a libertarian, and he has a libertarian account of free will that fits with the latest physics, fits with the latest neuroscience. So we might talk about that a little bit, but I don't want to pretend that that's why I take the position I do.
Amazing. Well, you've just done an absolutely wonderful thing that every interviewer dreams their interviewer will do, which is state a number of lovely controversial theses right up front that we can dig into. I mean, what I imagine that I imagine that my audience probably leans physicalist, or at the very least leans naturalist, right? Because I'm a naturalist, but I wouldn't necessarily call myself a physicalist. And probably the inherited position on kind of the internet, at least, that comes with that is going to be some form of determinism. Normally, an argument for determinism of this kind normally sort of goes something like, let's take a, Laplace's demon type thing. Imagine that you knew, or an outside observer knew every single position and particle in the universe and knew all of the natural laws, and wouldn't it just be the case that they could derive all of the subsequent events? And doesn't this rule out the idea that we can do otherwise? Now, you've, in videos and in talks and in interviews, you've taken a lot of issue with a number of underlying assumptions with arguments like that. And I'd love to chat through some of them. So yeah, what in your view is the determinist doing wrong when they give that kind of argument?
Yeah. So I'll talk about the argument in a minute. I think if people go have a look at some of the videos I've done on this, I think we have really good reasons to deny causal determinism anyway. I think many people that push this line do, like Sapolsky and others, would say that this does mean we don't have moral responsibility, for example, because everything we do is just caused. It's sort of we're sort of compelled to just do what we do by the laws, by the past states of the universe. So we're not morally responsible. However, I think it does more than that. It actually would undermine any kind of normativity, any kind of idea that there is a difference between what in fact happens and what ought to happen. So it's recognized in the moral case that if everything that happens is just what in fact happens, and there is no gap between what we ought to do and what we in fact do, and so we're kind of responsible because we ought to have done that, which was a possibility, but we did this instead. So I think it's correct. It does undermine ethical, moral responsibility. But similarly, there have been many people that have argued it would also undermine normativity in the rational domain. It would undermine the difference between how you in fact think and how you ought to think. So every kind of idea, every kind of thought would itself equally be just as caused, just as more like a reflex, or just as more dancing to the particles as anything else. So our theories about causal determinism, our logic and our mathematics, all these things that are part of our rational domain would equally suffer from the same loss of the difference between how you ought to think, or correct or true reasoning, and merely how we in fact or existent or actual reasoning. So there have been many that have recognized that causal determinism is itself an undermining or self-defeating thesis, because if it were true, then our belief in it itself would be merely caused and so on. So I think that line of thought is very interesting, and I have a video on that, so I won't go into any more than saying that.
I mean, I'd actually love to go into a tiny bit more, just because I think a lot of people find the line from determinism to moral responsibility at the very least intuitive, right? Because I disagree with it for compatibilist reasons that I'm sure we'll get into at some point. But I think that people the link, or the ported link between determined thoughts and determined reasoning chains and a lack of reason to then believe in determinism, I think that's a little bit more difficult to get your head around. Would you be okay going through that argument just sort of step by step?
Yeah. Okay. So some of this is to do with the history of thought. So I know you're a good Cambridge boy, Joe. So you'd have had you know your Frege, no doubt. So part of what Frege is trying to do at the end of the 19th, early 20th century is to try to explain how logic and derivatively mathematics and logical truths and mathematical truths are not merely psychological truths. So there's a movement at the time saying that given that we are just sort of evolved apes, then our mind must also be part of this sort of mere caused story. And so however we think must just be merely caused. And so logic is just a branch of psychology. And so we could explain logic just in terms of how people think. And Frege was very strict on saying, no, there's a difference between how people in fact think and how we ought to think. So he wanted to make sure that that distinction was firmly in play, because if you didn't have that distinction, we couldn't distinguish between valid reasoning, invalid reasoning, and justified inferences and unjustified inferences. And as he points out, which I think is true and sometimes easy to forget in the halls of academia, most people are not rational. Most people don't actually reason rationally. In fact, many people's ways of inferring things logically don't follow the rules that there are. And so it seems if you want to have a distinction between how people in fact reason or think logically and what the principles of logic are, we need to recognize relations of truth that hold independent of human minds, human psychology. And so that those logical principles set the standards for how you ought to think. They present to you the kind of success criteria for logical reasoning. In the same way we might think about, in the moral domain, the moral truths or the moral principles setting these standards for behavior or the success conditions for moral action. So this is sort of part of a wider notion of how we understand what truth is. Is truth merely descriptive, just a property of things, or is it sort of a normative standard that we ought to aim at in our beliefs and assertions and this sort of thing? And I'm very much on that sort of side.
So it's more like, the normativity of reasons wouldn't for you work under determinism for the same reason that moral normativity wouldn't work. It would be that, it doesn't make sense to say to someone, you ought to reason like this, if they couldn't have reasoned in any other way.
Yes, exactly. There doesn't seem to be any sort of falling short. Again, I can't quote them for you now, but if people look at the video, there's some very well summed up descriptions of this, and it's a debate that plays out. Air gets involved as well, and people sort of talk about computers, whether computers can get truth and falsity and so on. So there's a lot more to it that I can't necessarily completely lay down all the steps of it to you here. But I think that sort of underlying intuitive idea is quite straightforward to see, which is that if, for example, any kind of argument you could give for causal determinism were good, it would be good sort of by accident because it happened to follow what are objective principles of reasoning, which if we recognize that our argument is merely caused, or our thinking about it's merely caused, and remember, I'm assuming causal determinism here. We're going to get into the difference. I think you could have a sentence not causal. Then again, we would have no reason to believe our own arguments for causal determinism. So I think what we need to remove in our belief about causal determinism is at least the causal bit. And the causal bit of a causal determinist picture of the world is this idea of things being forced or pushed or kind of inescapable. There can be determinisms that don't involve that, which we probably talk about, that might not cause so much of a problem.
Absolutely. And I also think, an intuitive or some situation might be kind of fresh in people's minds to drawing this link between determinism and lack of reason might be the way that people will quite often say things like, large language models, they give the appearance of reasoning chains, but there's there's no deep reasoning going on there. It's just because it's, fully determined by the outcome of the code. People may or may not agree with that. And, but if you want a kind of an example that's kind of in the zeitgeist, that might be a good one to kind of puzzle through. I'm really interested in this distinction between causal and non-causal determinism because, when people often talk about determinism in kind of the public sphere, it's often implicitly just like causal determinism specifically. And one of the things you've talked about in the past, which I'd really like to get into, is that causal determinism, as it's normally put, involves a series of assumptions about causation and natural laws that people might not want to, that might not come as cheap as people might initially consider. Particularly if they lean Humean, for example. So I'd love to go through some of that. When someone makes an argument like everything is caused, including our actions, actually not even an argument, just that statement, what are the underlying assumptions that they're tapping into?
Yeah, good. So, in some ways, this links back to the way in which you put the Laplace's demon complaint. There are certain assumptions in how that's phrased that make the determinism a certain kind of determinism. So you have this idea that the demon knows everything in the past, knows the current state of things, and knows the principles by which the world unfolds, which would be the laws, and so it can predict what follows from it. So there's a few things that you might think make that impossible. First of all, is the demon part of this world or not? If the demon is part of this world, then whatever predictions he would make would be predictable. And there seems to be some regress problems if we're including predictions within the model of predictions. There's a good video on this that Richard Holton has somewhere on YouTube that you can find, that it seems as though we would get into a sort of a contradictory state of affair if we assumed that it's possible to predict predictions as well. We get into some loops. I won't say much more on that, but that's one potential issue. The other is it seems to have a particular view of time. The view of time is that there's something about the future that's open, whereas something about the past that's fixed. Now, that is certainly not given. And what's really quite strange here is many people, when they're arguing against free will implicitly assume there is some kind of flow to time, or there's some kind of asymmetry, not merely descriptively, but in terms of what is already unchangeable and what is potentially changeable when they're discussing free will, but then will in other places disown it. So, for example, I've seen a video of Sabine Hossenfelder saying we don't have free will. And at one point she says, you don't have free will because of the differential equations that govern Newtonian physics, mean that everything you do was already determined at the Big Bang, given those equations, because we could work forwards from it to calculate. Okay. But then the next video she puts out, she says, time isn't real. There's no such thing as time, really. There's just space-time, okay? And there is no future and past and present. We need to get over that. But if that's true, how do we even make sense of this idea of already? In what sense was what I do already decided by the Big Bang? Because there isn't this priority of the past over the future. It's not like the past happened first and then other things happened in a metaphysical sense. It might be that some of our explanations, some of our physical explanations, begin to explain the present in terms of the past and these equations. But what was also interesting in these Hossenfelder videos is behind her, she showed that the differential equations go both from past to future in Newton's laws, and you can work them backwards as well. You can work out how past states of the universe were based on current information. I mean, how do we know about the Big Bang? We know about it by running the equations in reverse to how things must have been in the past, given the regularity of the laws. So they do work in both directions. So you'd need to argue that there's something about what happened that constrains what now happens and what will happen, in a way that what happens has played no role in similarly constraining the past. So that's where this notion of constraint plays in, which seems to be built into this idea of cause, which is highly dubious for the sorts of reasons you said, because we've got all these different theories about causation. It's a very, very difficult thing to make sense of. What we do seem to have in physics is a kind of determinist relationship that we might think of as quantitative, mathematical, or logical in terms of explanation and interconnection. But it's not clear at all that involves anything like constraint or forcing or priority or any of these sorts of other notions that can get imported into it if we're really not careful. And actually on that, because I'm sure we're about to discuss it, I have here, for example, the Oxford Handbook of Causation, which is like thousands of pages long on all the different theories of causation that there are. And it's really only under a couple of those that we would even seem to, I think, conceptually have a problem for free will of this sort. And so I suppose that's one of the, that points at sort of two of the kinds of assumptions that are built into those sorts of arguments. Number one, what is the nature of time? How are we understanding time? Number two, causation or determinism and its relationship to causation, how we understand causation. And so there's a lot more under the hood work we need to do before we take some kind of off-the-shelf 30-second knockdown, no free will argument for granted and dig a bit deeper.
What are the ideas of causation that you think would give us the type of causal determinism that we'd like? And what are the kinds that you think fall short of that?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to have to start to talk a little bit wearing some of my idealist credentials.
Yeah, go for it.
In that, with all of these things, I think what we're dealing with are different kinds of concepts. We have the concept of cause, we have the concept of determinism. These are all different ways of making sense of the world, or different ways in which we might explain things or calculate things. So there is a kind of mathematical way of calculating things to do with quantities and relationships, and a logical way. Now, with all of these things, if you start to look at logical models or mathematical models, we tend to come up with kinds of relations that are atemporal. 2 + 2 is 4 is just an eternal truth, this sort of thing that Frege talks about. So if we are now involved in a form of description or a form of calculation that is mathematical or logical in nature, it tends to be atemporal. In fact, more than that, it tends to be completely indexical free. It's not the truth is nothing to do with whether I say it or you say it. Unlike something like I'm hungry might be true if I said it, but not true if you said it, for example. Saying it's Tuesday might be true tomorrow to say it, but not true today. So again, there's an indexicality in temporal claims. There's an indexicality in agent claims, I, you, and so on. And there's an indexicality in spatial claims, here, there. Now, the kind of determinism that physics uses is meant to be abstracted away from any kind of indexicality. So in that case, we have a form of explanation that I think isn't agentic at all. And it has nothing to do with our subjectivity. It has nothing to do with our locatedness, nothing to do with our perspective, and so on. There's another form of causation, another form of determinacy, though. What I should say then is that our notion of cause is not relevant or at play in that kind of explanation. In the same way, we don't think of 2 + 2 causing 4. We don't think of the squaring function causing 3 to become 9. That's not really the right way to talk. Similarly, we shouldn't say, according to Bertrand Russell, we shouldn't say gravity causes things to fall. That's just a very loose way of expressing things. Because if you look at, say, Newtonian equations, all it says is that the gravitational force is equal to the mass times the acceleration. So it's a quantitative identity that you get in mathematics with the equal sign. There's nothing causal. And again, as you know from doing logic in the first year, logical material implication is not causal. It's just a relation of truth functions. So I think that's perfectly fine. It's perfectly reasonable, perfectly correct in physics. That doesn't mean there is no causation in science, because there are other kinds of science that are experimental rather than theoretical. In the experimental sciences, what do you do? Well, what you do is you take a control group, maybe you hold certain variables constant, you vary certain things, and you see what the results are. That's done obviously in medical trials, biological trials, and so on. Now, what Collingwood and others that have come after that sort of initial Russell thing and more besides that have pointed out is that causation is relevant, is a relevant notion there. If I give this pill, that will cause the person to have this symptom or to get better and so on. But that notion of causation is then rooted in our deliberation and in our agency in the world. It's understood in terms of manipulation. If I manipulate A, that will cause B to be what it is. So causation in terms of how we can act on the world to manipulate the world is also something explored in science, but in experimental science. And that's very different but that doesn't tell the complete story. Any of those sorts of encounters are always defeasible. There could always something go wrong. You might do this and it doesn't work out for some reason. So you don't get this complete account in our causal explanations. You just get something that is sort of relevant to particular factors or particular considerations. So I'll just give one other little example to give you an idea of this that Collingwood puts forward. He says, well, suppose a car is driving on a road and goes into a ditch. He said, what is the cause of the accident? He says it's completely dependent on what kind of, what your interests are, right? If you're the driver, maybe the cause was that I didn't have a good night's sleep last night and I was feeling a bit tired and I wasn't fully with it. If you're the civil engineer, it might be the camber of the road or some friction on the road. If you're an insurance company, it might be something to do with the fault of the driver in not indicating correctly or something. And if it's the car manufacturer, it might be the slightly dodgy brakes or the tires and so on. So what Collingwood is saying is that our notions of causation and how they're deployed in our reasoning are always tied up with the question of what could I have done differently, or what within the domain of what is manipulable by me is relevant to explaining this sequence of events. In others, our causal reasoning is intimately tied up with our deliberative process about successful action and how we behave. So I think if we keep those separate, we could both, at least in principle, accept there is a certain kind of determinism in explanation without thinking there's causal determinism of the sort that kind of gives priority to the past or things of that sort and constrains us.
Yes, and presumably without letting go of causal language. I mean, I think Judea Pearl, is that the one who's really fleshed this out, this interventionist idea of causation out into a full mathematical framework that is very interesting, although it's been like years since I've read it. But I suppose one Yes, Hugh Price. Yeah, I mean, Hugh Price is. Oh, I love Hugh Price. Anyway, people on the channel know that I kind of bang on about him constantly. But I think that a lot of people in the audience who are, determinists and possibly even incompatibilists will sort of have a natural response of, okay, like you've said that, the causal determinism might rely on a series of philosophical assumptions that you may or may not want. They might even concede, as for instance Russell does, that the way that the description of the world at the kind of micro and even macro physical level might eventually be boiled down to these mathematical equations, which almost by definition go in both directions. And it's not an equation if it doesn't. They would then say, okay, that's fine, but this non-causal kind of determinism also might undermine our conception of free will. If there is, for example, I think broadly when a lot of people say that we don't have free will in the determinist sense, I think they tend to want, or what they tend to mean is that it undermines a picture whereby we're kind of traveling along our timeline, kind of quite happily chugging along. And then, we reach the present, and then we have, suddenly this kind of chugging along train track explodes into sort of 7 or 8 train tracks, and we get to freely choose, to kind of use somewhat loaded language, one of these train tracks that's going forward, and that will take us to a different path. I think that's the kind of picture that a lot of determinists, I'm thinking here about Van Inwagen, for example, that's the picture I get that he has in mind when he says that, if we hold all of the laws of nature, whatever they turn out to be, fixed, and we hold all of our past states fixed, then we'll be able to perfectly predict the future. And, incidentally, might be able to perfectly predict the past from some future state as well. That seems to be, and that to me seems like the kind of target he has in mind is this kind of multiple branching train tracks picture of free will. It seems like that picture is still undermined under non-causal determinism. So is it that you think that picture isn't what the libertarian believer in free will has in mind when they talk about, for instance, being able to have done otherwise? Or is it that that picture can be salvaged somehow?
Yeah, okay, so that's a really good question. So I would say that probably the most famous defenders of libertarian free will, who died recently, Robert Kane, he's the one who tends to be the sort of poster boy for this. He does affirm that kind of what he calls a garden of forking paths conception of reality, so that the past is sort of fixed now, at least, and that there are alternative paths in front of us. And Peter Tse, who I have talked about before, is a libertarian of that sort as well. So obviously, that would be if you did take a certain view of time where there's something special about the present and the past is fixed in a way that the future isn't, which isn't really the view of time I would take if I was interpreting it objectively. We can get onto some caveats to that when we talk about my idealism a bit in a bit, if you like. So to salvage that kind of view, you do have to say there's some kind of indeterminism, typically in the same way in this causal kind, sort of push forward causal kind. And there does seem to be ways you can do that from that naturalistic viewpoint or physicalist viewpoint that I'd put forward. So both Kane and Peter Tse are physicalists, and they argue that the way the brain functions is it ramps up basically quantum indeterminacy, and you get different forms of causation. So again, they're just using causal language, unlike what I suggested before. Where you get top-down causation, where you get causation at the level of patterns and form, not merely in that billiard ball. You could know everything. If you just knew the state of each neuron independently, you could calculate everything and say, no, the way the brain works is in terms of patterns and phase that you can only make sense of at the level of that system. So you have the whole causing the parts. Well, I'll say a little bit more about this before I get on to it, then the way I would interpret it slightly differently instead. So here's how someone listening might be able to understand it a little bit. If we take indeterminism seriously of a potential quantum kind, let's take a simple case like half-life. It seems like you can have the principles of the half-life of an isotope that will tell you what proportion of the isotopes will have decayed within that period, half of them. But that doesn't determine why this isotope decayed exactly when it did. Now, if you wanted to have any possibility of manipulating that, you would need to change the half-life. That won't deterministically change where it is, but that will change the odds on when it would decay. Now, Peter Sir, from what I understand from reading it so far, says that the brain has the capacity to reweight the ways in which neural connections interact with one another on the fly, setting criteria for firing patterns that are only realizable when certain patterns are initiated is not just to do with the charge at any given point. And he goes through very long explanations of exactly how that process works out in neurophysiology. The idea then is that you couldn't give an account of what happens in the brain merely at the level of the neurons. You have to talk about the overall states in which the brain is. And if you then take those overall states to be identical to mental states, including our experience of willing, he's saying that those mental states of what we might equate to willing could have been otherwise because there was indeterminacy prior to their realization. But they're not completely random either because they have been constrained by criteria that were set in place by previous decisions that reweighted our neural connections. So he has a way of saying there's something in between randomness and determinism where there is something that is reaction to criteria that close down on particular pathways and eliminate certain options and then spark lots of other options and do it. And basically he says we play out these things in our mind. And so it's correct to say that what we experience as a decision both could have been otherwise, but is also subject to reasons. So in some ways, the kind of theory that I come out with in my initial video responding to O'Connor, which is that a decision has two aspects to it. It has the reasons for which we decide, which are kind of like the criteria, but then there's an additional aspect. It's not merely quantitative, which was the stronger reason, that's why you did it. There's something else that means there's some play in it, which, as I say, he explains in terms of how different parts of the brain interact and what the volitional center is and so on, which is really, really interesting. So I think all I'm trying to do really is whet your appetite to say that if you're a hard physicalist and you won't accept any explanation that I would give in terms of how our concepts interact, then have a look at his stuff. I'm actually going to be interviewing him in a week, so maybe there'll be some more on my channel as well.
Amazing. And just to tease apart two different things, I think that, I suppose the underlying proposition that's being rejected there is micro-reductionism, the idea that everything at a pattern level can be exhaustively explained by everything, smaller than it, effectively. His position is that he's a physicalist, but he thinks that ultimately our levels of physical explanation have to take into account can't be exhausted by simply going down. They also have to take into account patterns and, in this case, brain patterns.
Okay, so absolutely, there's two things going on. So one of them you've pointed towards, which is the idea that the macro doesn't supervene necessarily on the micro. It's not that the micro happens first and then everything at the other level is sort of spills out of it. That actually the micro cannot be understood or explained without what he calls top-down causation. By top-down, he means sort of these broader patterns are the only way to explain what determines what happens on the micro. There's sort of a symbiosis. There's both upward causation from particles to brains and also downward causation from brains to particles. Now, he also explains that the only way you get this top-down causation is when you have systems that are attuned with these very small parameters that comes down to everything to do with the size of synaptic cleft and a whole bunch of other things that position the brain just so that this indeterminacy bubbles up to a level that interacts then with criteria that is set to do with the weighting functions, and then that reproduces, so you get these closed loops. So he denies that You could wind back time, have everything exactly the same, and have the same results follow, because there are criterial, pattern-based things that would change the way things went. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is this, which is that there are all these laws about, laws of energy conservation and things of that sort, that are principles of how standardly we've understood causation in the physical world, that he says don't apply when you have phase causing or causation at the level of information, which is linked to patterns, because patterns can arise and disappear. Patterns can be created and destroyed. There's no conservation of patterns. There's no conservation of sequences. These are temporal and spatial patterns. And if our mental life are basically patterns that we should understand in terms of classes of patterns arising in the brain, rather than something that completely can be derivative of how individual particles are, then many of the kinds of principles that we assume must apply don't really work, because they assume things like in Jae-Won Kim's this sort of notion of closure. So yeah, I think that's another thing to sort of understand. It sounds very interesting to me, and as I say, I'd like to look at it.
I'll have to check that out, because I won't ask you to defend it, because I know this isn't your positions, but that is really interesting. I mean, whenever I think of because I largely think of individual parts being explained by structures as kind of a mathematical thing mainly. It'd be lovely to I have to check that book out, because that sounds absolutely fascinating. But that's different from your own position, because you're not a branching train tracks kind of libertarian.
Right. Yeah. So I will just one final thing on that. So you're right. In terms of, you can show. So obviously, Peter says coming at things from the neurobiology, neurophysiology sides of things, but you can show in terms of the modeling that you're talking about. Christian List has an article where you can just show that if we take descriptions at one level of reality, and descriptions at other levels of reality, you can get indeterminism at one scale that means determinism at another scale, which kind of everyone knows. They say, well, I know that in the world of quantum mechanics, there's indeterminism, but as soon as you get up to a sufficient level of macro scale, you just have determinism, right? So, and then the brain is therefore just determinist. Peter's still saying, no, the brain is not determined, and because he's giving reasons from neuroscience. But even if you think it was, there can be other levels at which indeterminism re-emerges. This is what Christian List is showing, that you could have indeterminism at the quantum level, determinism at the level of, say, atoms and their interaction, but then indeterminism arising again when we start to give a psychological description and so on, because they can be multiply realized between these scales. So what that means is there doesn't seem to be any conceptual or mathematical problem with this sort of notion of top-down causation. You could have indeterminism at the level of your decisions and so on, which is kind of what we're interested in when we're talking about free will, even if some earlier layer is determined. Now, Peter is saying, no, the brain is also indeterminate, so I find that interesting. But again, you don't need to rely on that. Okay, so in my position, though, I don't think you need, or at least my libertarian position, I don't think you necessarily need to have this idea of a branching futures view. I've tended to separate out the two different ingredients you need in free will. One is this sort of sourced conception. The other is this could have done otherwise conception. And think that, you can definitely have could have done otherwise, even if you don't have branching futures. Because it seems fine to say the past could have been otherwise. It could have been otherwise yesterday. It could have been otherwise the Big Bang. And in fact, this is where we touch on to a conception of how we're understanding laws. Because scientists will sit around and talk about what the fine-tuning of the universe, for example. The fine-tuning of the universe question is, why are the laws tuned exactly as they are to have created this world? Basically, what they're saying is, the laws could have been otherwise, or it could have been otherwise, or the initial conditions of the universe could have been otherwise. And if they weren't exactly as they were, we'd have been in big trouble. And then they speculated about multiverse and so on. So scientists take seriously the idea that the past could have been otherwise. Okay, in nearly all of their reasoning. And even in trying to explain what laws are, typically they understand that as well in terms of could have been otherwise. F equals ma. What does that mean? Well, the force was 10, the mass was 2, the acceleration was 5. But if the mass had been 4, the force would have been 20. So it could have been otherwise. The mass could have been, in fact, could have been otherwise reasoning, or modal reasoning, is so tied into our entire way of making sense of what laws are, of what we're doing in science and so on, that it seems ludicrous to me that they would then turn around and say, but now you're talking about free will, there's no such thing as could have been otherwise. We've just got exactly as it is. We've got to hold all the past fixed, the present fixed. So I want to say that whether we could have done otherwise in any given circumstance is just a matter of what are the relevant features of what we're talking about. Were there alternative possibilities? And it seems to me that, yeah, there are, without sort of, I could have all the reasons that I have. I could have all the same personality that I have right now. But that itself doesn't seem to fix exactly what is chosen in the way that, say, Van Inwagen has the idea of you got the past and the laws, and then you have the decision that you make. Well, I'm happy to say that if I could have chosen otherwise, the past would then have been otherwise. We'd just be in a different possible world.
But are you and Van Inwagen necessarily disagreeing there? Because it seems like it's just, he's saying, well, we're holding Q fixed where, or holding P fixed where P is the set of facts up to now, and the set of natural laws, and then Q is the decision we make. And he's saying, well, they're since P is fixed, Q is fixed as well. And you're saying, well, if P had been different, then Q would have also been different. But I don't know Van Inwagen personally, but I get the sense, reading his work, that he'd be happy to accept that. He'd be able to say, no, I totally understand that in situations where, say, the initial conditions of the universe would have been different, we would have ended up making different choices. But he's kind of restricting his claim to the scope whereby the set of natural laws that we have are true and the set of past events are true. So where's the disagreement arising there?
So I think what it is that in his argument, he also then introduces this notion of being untouchable. So you have the logical connection between the previous facts and the laws and the current state. Now, and remember, this is a big if. As I said, I like the idea of the indeterminism stuff. I'm just not sure whether that would have to hold in order to have libertarian free will, as the likes of Kanan say that it would. The could have been otherwise, I interpret just in that logical mathematical way. It could have been otherwise currently, which then, given deterministic laws, mathematically deterministic laws mean the past would have been otherwise as well. We're in a different possible world. But then what Van Inwagen says is that, you don't get to touch or control what the past was and what the laws were. Therefore, you don't have any touch or control of what happens now. So this is where the two notions that are involved in the libertarian free will come apart. There's the sourced bit. Are you in control? Are you the source of the way things are? And then the could have done otherwise bit, which is, were there alternative possibilities? So I want to say, yes, there clearly were alternative possibilities, and I think everyone should accept that. That needs to be interpreted in an atemporal way that doesn't have this Garden of Forking Paths idea about the past being somehow fixed and the future being open, that there is metaphysically a difference. So I'm an eternalist about time when thinking objectively, i.e. when we're trying to reason purely logically and mathematically. There's no difference. In some ways, the future is what the future is, the past is what the past is. But as Russell has said, that's just trivial. That just means what will be, what has been, what is. Great. That's completely unenlightening, doesn't say anything about the nature of free will. Similarly, what could have been, what could be, and what might be, right? You can say that just as well. That's just as trivial. It's just recognizing a difference between what's possible and actual. Great. Now you have could have been otherwise. Then it's, but hang on a minute. Is it in your choice what happens or doesn't happen? Okay, now this is where Van Inwagen mixes the two together in a way that I think is not logically correct. So he claims if you could not have affected the past, then you cannot have affected the present. How do we interpret could have? This is maybe where you agree. So compatibilists say, what does it mean to say that you could have touched or you could have had control of what happens? It means that if you had so willed, then you would have done this. Okay? That, I think, is now discussing in terms of causal thinking. In causal thinking, we're talking about manipulability. Is there any manipulability? Well, now if we're taking ourselves as agents seriously, if we're taking an indexical view of me acting in the world, you're now treating yourself in that process of deliberation as an uncaused cause. You're now considering yourself as being something that is the instigator. We're now adding in the priority to this crystalline timeline where we want to say the prior thing is the decision and we consider what follows from it. And that's perfectly reasonable. What does that mean then? Where is the nub of the disagreement with Van Inwagen then? Van Inwagen assumes that where you have a logical connection or a mathematical connection, that capacity for control or sourcehood must follow those same logical relations. So if you're not the source of P, you can't be the source of Q. If you have no capacity to change P, you have no capacity to change Q. This happens all over in philosophy. It happens again in the Cartesian demon thing about if P implies Q, if I know P, does that mean I have to know Q? One thing is saying, no, that doesn't hold. Q follows from P, but I can know P and yet not know Q, even if I know that P implies Q. I can know I have hands without knowing I'm not a brain in a vat, even if I know that one follows from the other. Same thing. This notion of touchability or sourcehood just doesn't follow those logical connections because it's a different conception. This is a conception linked to our own conception of causation, which, as I said, is rooted in our experience as agents manipulating the world. So I want to keep those two separate. There's nothing incoherent about the idea of being the source of our actions, and that's perfectly fine with causal reasoning, which we have good reason to think is tied with agency. And then there's this separate intellectual modal reasoning in which we can have could have done otherwise, as the scientists accept. And free will is the holding together of both of these. I am not giving an account of how those two completely different ways of interpreting the world come together. Maybe Peter is talking about that. Because of my idealism, I'm happy to hold those separate. We sometimes reason this way, sometimes reason that way. And maybe those explanations don't mesh together so well. Even if they don't, I still think we have free will.
Right. Okay. So there's in effect, I mean, perhaps I imagine that I probably will slightly get this wrong, but is it that our idea of causation and thus our idea of sourcing a cause is effectively, flows is kind of rather is more epistemic than metaphysical, as in like when I'm imagining whether I'm going to will something or would have willed something, I'm imagining what I would do in that situation. But again, I mean, I don't know, and again, as I say, I'm not in Wagen's head, but I don't get the sense that this seems like something he'd take all that issue with. I feel like he'd be happy to say that, yeah, no, I get that if you imagined yourself going to the past and changing something and then you would have done differently, like I feel like he'd be okay with all of that. I think that in a lot of ways, what he seems to be trying to rule out is this branching tracks component. And that, this, I don't know, I suppose maybe it's just that I feel like that you and Van Inwagen are using could have done otherwise in really quite different ways. I know I don't want to go saying, oh, this is just confusion of language, but it does seem like that this could have done otherwise is being used with two really different scopes. You're quantifying over a series of possible worlds where the past can be altered and the present and the future can be altered, which is, that's not an illegitimate way to do that at all. And he's saying, I want to find out how many possible worlds there are if we keep the past and the laws of nature fixed. And he's saying, I only find one. But these seem to, I think that it seems like the same person could believe both of these or use the phrase could have been otherwise in these two ways, like totally like unproblematically.
Yeah. So, okay, good. A couple of things. Number one, Van Inwagen actually does believe we have free will, but he just thinks this is an argument that shows that we have to sort of take it, I don't know, on faith or something. So I don't know what he would agree with or what he wouldn't. I'm just looking at his argument. So if you're right, that his argument is merely, if we have causal determinism, and if we keep the past fixed, there is only one future. I would want to say, no shit, Sherlock. I mean, it's like, it's already baked in, right? Causal determinism just says basically that given a complete state of the universe and the laws unchangeable, there is only one future. Nobody disagrees with that. The libertarian of the Kane and Peter Suss sort want to say, yeah, there's indeterminism. They reject causal determinism. That's the only way you could have a garden of forking paths, is if there is indeterminism baked into the nature of things. So they're going to be fine with Van Inwagen's argument. Van Inwagen's argument, understood that way, is merely just the definition of what causal determinism is, if you add in that conception of time, right? You could have causal determinism and thinking that given a complete state of the universe at time t, all the other things are determined, but just then saying, but there were other ways in which that world state could have been, so we have these other possible worlds, but every world is just a single timeline, right? If you have a worlds that have a branching timeline, you have to add in the indexicality of where are you in that time, and you have to have something like indeterminacy to do that. So I'm just saying that if I'm assuming determinism, there are no branching futures by definition. I don't think that that is enough to remove libertarian free will. I don't think, if we understand libertarian free will as requiring both could have done otherwise and sourcehood. But what I'm saying is that the could have done otherwise understanding is metaphysical in nature. And the sourcehood conception, I mean, you're talking about epistemic. Well, I want to think it's not necessarily merely epistemic. It's to do with adding in all the other stuff that is linked to our agential interpretation of the world. I'm an idealist. I actually think that's and you've got pragmatist leanings, right? So
no, exactly.
You've got, right. Okay. So the pragmatist is going to try to interpret things first and foremost in terms of usefulness, in terms of what we're trying to achieve, in terms of aims and objectives and so on. That's a very different way of telling a story and making sense of the world in which we live. It takes time seriously. It takes things like intentionality seriously. I think that's a perfectly legitimate way of making sense of the world, right? I also think it's a perfectly legitimate way of making sense of the world when you're talking purely in terms of logic and mathematics and how things are in this sort of eternal, indexical-free way. Because I'm an idealist. I think pragmatism is missing out that side of the rational, crystalline, truth logical side, right? And they're missing out on the fact that we are also agents located with a perspective and so on, with aims, objectives, and information. There may be a story that connects those two together, which is the sort that I'm gesturing towards, that I'm looking into now. Whether or not that story is true, I think you can still have them both separately. And if you have them both separately, as far as I'm concerned, you have everything you need or could want for a libertarian free will, or what I take to be a libertarian free will.
So it seems in effect that that Van Inwagen has is it that he's got a definition of libertarian free will that you think is too narrow. It's not encompassing the kind of idea of libertarian free will that you would accept.
Well, I mean, as I said, I'm not. I mean, some people seem to think I'm not too bothered about labels, whether I count as compatibilist or not. I think that I call myself a libertarian because I think free will is incompatible with causal determinism. Okay? If that's what Van Inwagen is saying, on the assumption of causal determinism, you can't have the future set, you don't have free will, then I think I'd agree with that. But you can have determinism of a non-causal sort and still have could have done otherwise, as far as I can tell. And then when we're thinking causally, we're talking in terms, there is causal determinism. When we're thinking causally, we treat ourselves as uncaused causes in our decision-making process, and we reason from there. When we're reasoning pragmatically and aim-orientated, and I'm deciding what I want to have for breakfast and all of this stuff, then we are reasoning causally. We're reasoning about how we can manipulate the world for our ends. Great. There's certainly no threat to free will there. And actually, when you look at, there's a brilliant article by Collingwood that I'd recommend to anyone listening, which is on the so-called notion of cause, where he talks about how the idea of cause even came to be. We started off with this idea that reality is ultimately chaotic. Only mindedness brings order to chaos. And because of that, initially we thought the world is this unpredictable thing. It rains suddenly, it might blah, 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 blah. But humans bring some kind of order to it. The notion of cause was actually about if I provoke you to do something, I've caused you to do something. The notion of cause is purely how we influence each other and bring order to one another's actions. It was a legal term of who's to blame and who isn't to blame. We then started to recognize some order in the world outside of us, seasons and so on. And so we thought there must be gods out there. Why is the tide coming? Because the god has willed it, right? Later on, then, we started to interpret the world outside of us more mechanistically, more law-like. And we started to understand it in rational grounds rather than pragmatic, will-based, teleological grounds. And we went away from Aristotle's teleological interpretation of the world to the post-Cartesian efficient cause way of interpreting the world. We actually now no longer were thinking in causal terms about the world, but we forgot. And we still kept talking as that's causal. We now have this mishmash of thinking that the world is forcing us, like the gods, to do what we do and we're just puppets. We don't have free will. Whereas actually, no, now we need to just be thinking in terms of rational connections, reasons for things, in Leibniz sense of sufficient reasons to interpret the world. And that is no threat to free will because it doesn't constrain or force us. It's just our way of rationally interpreting the world. So then the idea would be that causation doesn't even make sense if we don't assume that we are agents acting for reasons and reintroduce teleology into things. And again, and I'm throwing so much out, I know that, so sorry about that. This is what I think I see the seeds in what Peters is talking about, which is he's saying informational causation is more like what Aristotle would call a formal cause. It's how the form of things, the pattern of things and the structure of things itself is causally influential on material, on matter, and then efficient cause, which is causation going forward.
Okay. So
is
this, yeah, and is that why you find non-causal determinism far more free will friendly, let's say, or libertarian free will friendly than causal determinism, because it doesn't have this kind of puppeteering effect?
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So would you?
I think one of them is
So would you be more say we were to recast Varney and Vaughan's argument merely in terms of non-causal determinism? Would you be okay with that? You would just say like that I'm perfectly happy to accept that argument, and also I think that is a picture of the world that supports libertarian free will.
Yes, with the addition saying that then he shouldn't make the second half of the argument and say, therefore, because P is untouchable, we have no capacity to control that. We have no capacity to control Q, because the notion of control is a causal notion. Okay, it's a notion of agency. So I want to say that how things are logically connected has nothing to do with how we interpret control or sourcehood or anything of that sort. That's a completely different way of reasoning. That's a pragmatist way of reasoning. You're committing like a category error if you take principles of logic and apply them to what comes first, priority in terms of explanation for action.
Yes, I mean, I think I broadly agree with that. As in, like, I think that but perhaps for different reasons. I'd be interested actually to know what people who consider themselves determinists think of that position. I think a lot of them might be significantly friendlier to that kind of viewpoint than they might have initially thought.
Yeah.
I mean, it's non-causal determinism. I find increasingly to be like an attractive position. That's my, I'm a compatibilist about free will for various reasons, but that's the kind of foundation of my view. Partly because I think that causal, partly for the reasons that Russell gives about the symmetry of physical equations, but also just because I think that when I think about how Laplace's demon formulates this idea of determinism, I think actually that doesn't sound like it. Like there's nothing necessarily causal about that. As in, it's just a demon outside who knows a lot of things. And that seems to me to be perfectly compatible with the kind of non-causal determinist picture. So actually, I've over the years come to see that actually, there's non-causal determinism seems to me to be a little bit stronger than causal determinism, not least because, not least because I think it kind of gets at what we want, which to me, I think the thing that people find disturbing about determinism more generally, or the thing that like unsettles people, is actually this idea of an imagined observer outside of the model being able to predict and see the model stretched out before them with all of the ends already defined. I think that's what strikes me as so unsettling about it. Anyway, that's kind of what gets my like philosophical juices flowing there. I think that.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if this is because you've obviously Richard Holton, and I think that it's a good example of how much your lecturers' opinions influence you. Because in first year I got lectured by Richard on free will, and I came away with it basically with this idea that I think that free will contains an awful lot of sub meanings inside it. So an interesting thought experiment I think people could go away and do is I sometimes think, okay, let's imagine different points along the kind of determinist scale. What if everything literally was determined? Like, what would we be left with out of free will? And I thought, well, even on the most extreme version, the most uncharitable, incompatibilist position possible. Let's just imagine kind of toy societies. What would they come up with? And I thought, well, they'll still need a system for deciding when it's appropriate to disincentivize and incentivize behavior.
Mhm.
And so they're going to come up with some kind of very, very, very minimal idea of free will. In determinist town, they're going to still come up with some idea, some way of sorting out the behavior that it makes sense to provide incentives and disincentives about, and the behavior that it doesn't. The behavior that doesn't at the extreme end. There's a reason why if somebody's knee was hit and for whatever reason the reflex made someone fall off a cliff, there's a reason we wouldn't punish them for that, even in deterministville, and it's because there'd be literally no point. And on the other end, if somebody of their own premeditation decides to go out and murder someone, there's a reason in deterministville that we punish that, and it's because we want to encourage fewer people to do it, and that is a link along the causal chain that, in theory, would then discourage people to do it further. And then we have these kind of middle ground things. If some one of my favorite cases for kind of stimulating intuitions about this is cases where somebody has had a brain tumor in a particular part of their brain, and it's made them, so to speak, go out and become really violent. I think there's an example of a guy who had a brain tumor grow in a particular part of his brain. He started beating his own children. And then it was removed and he was back to normal. But then it came back and he started beating them. And there are these, and it's very easy for somebody to say, oh, well, okay, but that's because his brain made him do it. But I kind of think, well, unless you're a Jew, your brain has made you do all of the things. So that doesn't get you any further. I think, okay, well, if we imagined in that situation, it seems like the definition of free will we're using is something like, if I admit this behavior into my model of this person and use it to predict their future behavior, will it be helpful or not? And in the case where somebody's just had a brain tumor removed, no, it wouldn't be helpful. And so we kind of assign it as unfree in that sense. And I think that's what I kind of took away, I suppose, was this kind of deep idea that freedom and being free means a whole series of different things. I mean, a classic one is just that even under a libertarian conception of free will, and even under the most, the most extreme version where you've got all the branching paths, if somebody puts a gun to someone's head and is like, do this or I'm going to shoot you, when they do it, or if they do it, we tend to say, well, that's in a sense importantly not free. So I do think there's a lot of polysemy going on in how we assign freedom. An interesting thing consideration that I've kind of somewhat nicked from Hugh Price's analysis of truth, where he decides not to analyze what truth is, but what truth does, and then go back, is that I think that there's room for an analysis of free will that borrows from that and asks, well, what does free will do? It largely allows us to proportion incentives or proportion praise and blame. Thus, we should start there and work backwards, which I suppose would be another way of approaching the problem. I've kind of forgotten where I went with the beginning of this, but no, I suppose the polysemy of free will is my main point.
Yeah, I think So there's lots there that I think is really good. I'll pick up on a couple of things. So one was what you're getting to towards the end, which is, I think that our conception of free will is a metaphysical idea, but the way in which we sort of reason causally or reason in terms of free will is in this sphere of again, I'd call it the good. It's a question of that involves both the moral and it also involves the practical, what is useful. So I think if you deny that we have any free will, you couldn't live that out in the way that you're talking about. You couldn't construct a society because you would lose the distinction, as you say, between punching someone and having a muscle spasm. And And so we absolutely need that concept. And I think that concept comes in with the idea of causation. It comes in with the idea of taking time seriously, apportioning blame, and so on. So we will have to do that for sure. Now, what's interesting is obviously some of the earlier stuff you said is about how our the deterministic physicist argument against free will is very similar to the old theistic or theological problems with free will that Augustine wrestles with, which is if God knew everything, how could I be free to do otherwise? And his answer is quite similar, I think, to what I'm sort of suggesting we can say in the physics case and yours as well, which is that God knowing things doesn't mean he made them happen. If God's perspective is merely passive, it just means he saw what we will in fact choose or what we do in fact choose. So if you want to explain where the actions came from, even if they're in the future, you can explain them or apportion blame or responsibility or causal efficacy to us as agents. And in that interaction, God's knowledge is passive. He knows because we in fact choose, or we in fact do, even if we haven't got there yet. So really this notion about blame, responsibility, or causation creates an asymmetry in terms of not merely explanation, although it's linked to that. It's to do with this idea, what can we manipulate? What is within our grasp to control? And what will follow from that sort of automatically? And in that sense, that's where the causal bit comes in. Causal determinism, I think, only happens after you've made a decision. Then we reason causally from there. But in deliberation, at least, we're not treating the decision as part of a causal chain. Even if there are explanatory connections of all sorts from the God's eye perspective or deterministic.
And I suppose even an incompatibilist could accept that from a kind of phenomenological standpoint. Like, I do think that is, in fact, how we think about decisions, or at least it's how I think about decisions, I suppose. You've mentioned a couple of times, actually, it'd be nice to kind of talk about your idealism, because idealism's I'm kind of having a bit of a comeback, I suppose, in the popular sphere, at least. I mean, well, it's been having a comeback in analytic philosophy since like the 1980s, I guess. But it's having a comeback more popularly, more recently. And you're an idealist, and you talk a lot about F.H. Bradley, who is also an idealist, who I don't know very much about. I was saying before we started recording, and perhaps those of you who've also been to kind of British analytic philosophy departments will have been fed this story as well. There's a certain story about 20th century British philosophy that goes a little bit like this, which is that, in the mid to late 19th century, there was all sorts of nonsense going on, like Bradley and these British idealists who are basically just sort of making things up and talking absolute tosh. And then Russell and Bertrand Russell and G. Moore kind of came in and said, right, no, we're doing philosophy properly now, and ushered in the golden age of analytic philosophy. That was what I was taught as an undergrad. Not in those terms, but that was a kind of background assumption. And I've always thought, there's probably a sense in which that might be simplifying things slightly, or maybe being a bit uncharitable to Mr. Bradley. So who was Bradley? What did he believe? And how is his idealism different from people like, Kant at the one end of the scale, but also, people like, modern idealists like Bernardo Kastrup and things like that?
Wow. I mean, that's just like a big invitation for me to start preaching at you, Joe. So in terms of the story and who Bradley was, I think, and the kind of the myth that's been inherited, yes. I mean, there are plenty of academic sources to look at to see why this myth really is a bit of a myth. Probably the most accessible one is Stuart Candlish's book, The Russell Bradley Debate. But as I said, I think right at the beginning of our conversation, people don't take philosophical positions purely on the basis of evidence. And there are a whole lot of kind of political, cultural, and social reasons for why Moore and Russell, were doing what they were doing. Similarly, there was a lot of reasons for why Bradley and the other British idealists at the time were doing what they were doing. So, I mean, in the 19th century, you had such an upheaval in terms of how we understood ourselves, how we understood the nature of the world, how we understood our connection, the role of science, the role of religion. And what was happening at the time was various different new sciences came out, were undermining all the ways in which we made sense of the world. So the authority of the Bible as a historical text and a scientific text was being undermined from fossil records and textual criticism. We then had the theory of evolution that came later that questioned where we came from. We didn't have the divine mark of God in our capacity to reason and understand, but we had evolved from sort of chaos and all of this sort of stuff. And then psychology was also coming into play. They're saying we're not even rational. We're driven by sort of unconscious urges and so on. So what sort of happened to promote British idealism, I think, was a way of trying to say yes to all of this new scientific understanding, but to say no to the additional claim that was prevalent in the emerging materialism, which said, and that's all, folks. So I think you've actually had something to do with Alex Oliver, but he often puts it this way, my supervisor at Cambridge and one of your master supervisors, I believe. Often we're unaware that in many of our accounts, we can explain things, but we need an additional assumption that says, and there is nothing else. There are no other truths. And if I were to sum up what Bradley, for sure, but the British idealists at the time are trying to do is to say yes to all the truths coming out of science, but to reject the "that's all, folks" clause that gets added as well. So science, the truths that there are the truths of science. Now, this doesn't mean that they were saying we then also adopt all of the religious views. Instead, their interest is philosophical, it's metaphysical, saying on what basis do we assume that the truths of science are the only truths there are? And here's the things they rejected. Bradley, in fact, rejected. He rejected the reductive understanding of physics, which is we've been touching on, the idea that certain truths are nothing but, or just are, these are the truths. You say they are, but not just are. So I think he would reject ideas like Occam's razor, for example. This comes out really, really wonderfully at the end of one of his early chapters in Appearance and Reality, where he says things like, if you're engaged in a science, it is no doubt practically useful to ignore certain aspects when you work. If these factors and these ideas don't impinge on what you're studying or on what you wanted to talk about, don't talk about them, forget them, set them aside. He said, but to then say that such things do not therefore exist is barbarous metaphysics. So he and those like him are trying to have an understanding of the world that, in his terms, makes sense of the world in the whole or in completeness as a system. So if there is some aspect of the world, of our experience of the world, it must find its place in our final account or story of everything. So it's not attempting to reduce the things we talk about, say, oh, those things are not real, they're epiphenomenal, they're illusions. All you need is this story and the rest kind of spins out. He's instead trying to come up with a metaphysics of system. How does our way of sort of moral reasoning or our reasoning for action interact with our way of trying to intellectually make sense of the world or logically or mathematically make sense of the world? And how do these ways play in with our aesthetic engagement of the world? Why do we find some things beautiful, some things ugly? Where does pleasure and pain fit into all this? So he has this really broad kind of idea about what metaphysics is about. We have the very, very difficult task of trying to make sense of human experience in the whole. How do you do that? Well, you have to do it, he says, rigorously, carefully, step by step, adopting criteria, being clear about your methodology, and so on. But you certainly don't wed yourself to the methodology of, say, physics. You don't go down the route that analytic metaphysics went since Russell, which is either tying yourself to language or models of logic, and so on. So that's kind of what their project is. So they want to make space for our aesthetic engagement with the world, for our moral engagement with the world, for our religious engagement with the world, and our scientific engagement with the world, and seeing how we can have a coherent way of understanding how all these bits and pieces fit together. So that's one ingredient. You asked also about how that idealism was different to Kant and so on. I would more clearly draw a distinction between Bradley and Hegel.
Oh, okay.
So your listeners might not know that much about Hegel. But Bradley was accused of being a Hegelian, famously by Ayer, who misrepresented Bradley to a crazy degree. In fact, so did Russell. I mean, they're very naughty boys. They're very naughty boys.
I mean, there's a lot of misrepresentation. Russell's History of Analytic Philosophy. I love Russell, by the way. This is not a dig on him, but he's quite uncharitable to a distortive extent. I mean, he does the same thing with I don't know Henri Bergson in any detail at all, but one of my friends is very into Henri Bergson. He says that a similar thing happens with Russell's engagement with Bergson. So I'm disappointed but not surprised, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, Russell, he had a political project. He had something he was trying to do. So did Moore, and in that sense, they were very successful. I mean, they did change the way in which philosophy went, but that doesn't necessarily mean they did so through winning the intellectual battle. And there's a whole lot of things that go into the history of philosophy and how it went. It's partly to do with Bradley's somewhat impenetrable writing style. It's also a little bit to do with the fact he didn't try to formalize things in the way we expect. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work to do there academically. But for me, his instincts were right, and he's massively influenced my thinking. But here's why he was called a Hegelian, but why he isn't a Hegelian. So he's called a Hegelian because at the time when the Victorian Christianity in Britain was seemingly coming apart at the seams, there were, I think Herbert Spencer was his name, translated Hegel's works into English. So they came late to England. And people trying to defend a religious conception of the world got very excited about it because they wanted to say that, he makes space for religion, even though he makes it subservient to philosophy, but sees that reality as an unfolding rational process of just reason and logic in the course of history and so on. And they thought this was a way to sort of add in that sort of narrative, rational aspect back into reality, which is more kind of theism friendly. So Bradley was deeply influenced by Hegel. I mean, Bradley himself had a bit of a funny relationship with Christianity. It sounds like his dad was quite a harsh vicar of an evangelical sort. So he had his own concerns with it intellectually, but he always attended church. So he's very religious, not exactly, but he didn't believe in an afterlife and things like this. So an interesting character, which is always fun. But he rejected Hegel's view, and this is what I think is his masterstroke. He rejected Hegel's idealism rooted in thought. So for Bradley, he was really good friends and had a lot to do with William James and the emerging things coming out of psychology. He said that we don't merely engage with reality through thinking about it. Reality itself is more than thought. It involves feeling, and it involves volition. It involves agency in doing things. So he rejected Hegel's idea that the real was the rational. So Bradley thinks, no, reality is more than the rational. And in fact, the rational isn't even in on the ground floor. We don't first engage with the world rationally, and then we engage with it in terms of free will or agency, and then aesthetically. Actually, we engage with the world more directly in feeling, and thought comes late to systematize and structure so that we can do something with it. Now, this, I think, now is incontrovertibly correct in philosophy of mind stuff I'm reading, psychology, all of that. And I've got an 8-month-old daughter, and I've got two slightly boys. And you see it. We, as babies, don't interpret the world rationally. The rational, structural way of encountering the world comes much later than our initial felt engagement with the world. If you accept that, automatically, science is not the full story. The theories of science can't be the full story because they're expressible in language and in thought and in structure. They may be the best ways to model the world intellectually to aid understanding. But if there's more to reality than what can be thought and understood, in particular, the agential part of reality, which is linked to ethics, utility, pragmatics, all of that good stuff. And same with the aesthetic domain, what makes things of value, what makes things beautiful, what makes things pleasurable. These are untouched by science by design, because science is an intellectual way of understanding reality. And so he thinks is philosophy. So philosophy isn't at the top of the tree either. You can understand the world through art. You can understand the world through living an exemplary moral life. It's this kind of idealism that I think is so attractive. And it's actually this side of idealism that I don't see coming back in so much, at least in the analytic forms of idealism. You mentioned Nader Kastrup, you mentioned, but you didn't mention them, but there are others like Hoffaber, Thomas Hoffaber, who's arguing for idealism from a philosophy of language point of view. There's Horgan and Paterk, they're arguing for monism. But again, they're all still caught in that analytic philosophy way of, we are idealists because it makes the most sense of our linguistic modeling, or of our accounts of reference, or our views of truth, or in Kastrup's, he's still got that naturalistic reductive idea of vibrating strings and so on. For me, Bradley's idealism is very different. It starts not to try and explain the world purely in terms of thought or in terms of how things are, but from what I think of as a proper idealist foundation of the ways in which we experience the world. And thought is only a subset of that.
Right. So if I was going to sort of re-describe it to check that I kind of understood it, is it that for Bradley, the what he's doing is kind of carving up our phenomenology in a way, like as in the reality is the kind of full richness of phenomenal experience, and then models are one way, scientific models and philosophical models are ways of predicting and engaging with and manipulating that experience in various ways, but that there are elements like the sheer experience of beauty or what have you, that don't admit. It's not that they don't admit of scientific explanations in that, you couldn't come up with a neurological or psychological story as to how they come about. It's that instead, like, engaging in the experience of feeling beauty or, let's go with beauty as an example. Like, feeling beauty is in and of itself a kind of valuable thing to do. Am I kind of getting at it here? Because I mean, I agree in the sense of like, yeah, I think there is definitely something in that. I mean, I come at that from a kind of, I don't know, I think I've inherited that almost from Hume, because I'm a big Hume fan. And a lot of, people underestimate the extent to which Hume is, like, he's, in many ways deeply methodologically naturalist, but also like the subject isn't, like, he is, I would argue, deeply like anti-materialist in a way, because the stuff that he's carving up isn't the world, it's experience. Like, he has a, famously incredibly kind of iffy about saying anything about the world. I don't know, is that a good way of understanding this, or have I missed the mark?
No, you're obviously very quick on the uptake, Joe. Yeah, so there's a lot of really good stuff in that. You said, I'll say one little thing about what you said about Hume at the end, and then I'll jump into it a bit more. So you'd mentioned about idealism making a comeback. There's this interesting line in Problems of Philosophy where Russell basically says, for some reason, idealism has presented itself as uniquely attractive to anyone who sits and thinks about things for long enough. They often end up becoming idealists. And he says the history of philosophy is almost the history of idealism in its different forms. He says that you might even say that most philosophers have been idealists. That's what Russell says in Problems of Philosophy in his sort of earlier writing. And then there's a debate about where Russell ended up. How idealist was he at the end of things when he's constructing the physical world out of sense data?
Well, I used to use the example of Carnap. I mean, I'm tongue in cheek when I say that Carnap's an idealist, but Carnap is like, phenomenalist, I suppose, would be like the term that's often used. But the gap between phenomenalism and a kind of like totally naturalistically acceptable idealism, where it's not saying that there's mysterious stuff out there and there are thoughts. Like, it's when somebody says, like, if somebody says the world is made of mental stuff, that sounds very crazy. But saying that what we are trying to make sense of is our own experience in various different ways is like that. That to me sounds like a significantly more that to me is a very naturalistic thing to say, and a very kind of almost a very Vienna Circle thing to say. So I don't know. I mean, it's why I once said that. So I was asked whether I was a physicalist once, and I said that physicalism is too much metaphysics for me, and that's kind of coming from this starting point, the kind of Hume Carnap genealogy, I suppose. That views the subject matter as experience rather than as stuff. And stuff is great, but it's the model that we make out of experience.
Okay, so Brilliant, of course. But I think this is only apparent, I think, when you start to do enough philosophy to realize how much really idealism in some form or other is almost inescapable. So the blip here isn't idealism is suddenly making a comeback from some point. The blip has been this sort of idea that we can not worry about how we know things or how we experience things. We can just sort of leap that gap and say how the world really is in and of itself. And this has come out in the analytic turn because we stopped thinking about the things that Russell was thinking about, even judgment. How do we judge how things are? Instead, just talking about what follows from what in this sort of logical space where there's just consequence, but there's no inference going on. We are not a part of this. It's just how things are out there. So I think that's the blip. And that is coming apart in all sorts of ways in philosophy of mind, because it can't seem to account for consciousness and other things like that. It's coming apart in philosophy of language, because it's really hard to get this reference thing going on. It's coming out in metaphysics and the sorts that I'm talking about as well. But I'm saying that it still hasn't recognized, I think, that we need to also look beyond thought and look beyond language. That, I think, is still the lesson that we can learn from Bradley. So how does that... So what you said is right. We've got these different spheres of experience. We have our aesthetic engagement with the world. We have our agential, moral, volitional engagement with the world. We have our intellectual, reasoned understanding with the world. They are different modes of engagement. However, they're not entirely separate, because the unity of experience somehow meshes these all together. If I look out the window and I see a stabbing, I have a moral experience. I don't just see piece of metal enter flesh. I see a murder. Like, I'm immediately seeing the horror and the immorality completely tied in with the physical movement of object into object. And I'm also feeling this horror, this repulsion. I'm having an aesthetic, moral, and understanding intellectual experience all in one. But if I'm now in the mode of thought and theorizing, trying to explain what's going on, my ethical account, my intellectual account, and my aesthetic account don't gel so well together, right? It might not logically cohere that these all sort of work together, but that's actually what you'd expect if thought is also only one aspect of the whole, right? We're trying to do all three of them within one mode. We're trying to do all three within the mode of explanation. So this is where Bradley's metaphysics, including his views on truth, including his views on also the self, which you touched on with Hugh, these all have to be understood in terms of how they interrelate. So his idea is that in feeling, we engage with the world in this direct, unmediated way, which involves, I think he says, difference but not distinction. So there's variation, but there aren't hard boundaries of that thing, and that. So we have this complete whole that is at a level of detail beyond description. It's analog, not digital. Then we interpret it and make sense of it. This is quite Kantian so far, right?
Yeah.
In terms of, structuring it with it's William James as well. He'd agree to.
Yeah.
We have the concept then applied to carve up and structure reality. And it also appears in philosophy of mind, even sort of Dennett and Bloch and all this certain other level of consciousness where we can now linguistically describe it. That's the level of thought. Now, truth is where we're now trying to unify our felt engagement with the world in this immediate way with our way of understanding the world through thought. He says there's advantages in both. The felt encounter with the world has a level of detail that cannot be captured in thought, and also is where we encounter being. We only ever butt up against reality as reality in our feeling. We bash into things. We experience the reality of the world only in our feeling of it. And he calls that, in feeling, there is both the what and that. There's the that it is, and then the what, which is the content of it. Thought then systematizes and organizes that content by abstracting it from our felt experience so that we can model the reality outside of what we're feeling. So we can think about tomorrow, what's happening outside my office door. We can now build a much bigger world that transcends the boundaries of our finite, as we're finite centers of experience. We can model the world outside. Truth is when those two things reunify. But its reunification has to be the consummation of a thought in its fullest unthinkable detail, because it would have to replicate the detail and the being of what we encounter in feeling, which it can't, because thought has to be somewhat universal and general and structured in nature and relational, which felt experience isn't.
Yeah.
Felt experience also has to transcend the limitations of what I personally see and feel to reach the notion of a all-encompassing felt whole, which is what he sees in the absolute. And then that links to the ethical domain with volition and so on. So all I'd say at this point is a little taster would be that in all of this, you have a view of the world that involves things like intentionality, aboutness. Your thoughts are about feelings or possible feelings and so on. You have the notion of truth, which isn't mere coherence within the realm of thought, because it's about thought's unification with another aspect of experience, feeling. But in none of this do you go outside experience itself and its multifaceted dimensions. And in some ways, that's the obviousness of idealism. The obviousness of idealism is you can't think about what you're not thinking about. You can't think of what you're not thinking of. You can't feel what you're not feeling. This is kind of a bit like Berkeley's master argument, broader, right? What else could there be? Anything else there could be you're either thinking about or you're feeling or something. So that's kind of a kind of obviousness of idealism, which I think is what draws people back to it. So truth is that how parts of experience interrelate rather than how experience relates to something not experience.
Yeah. And I suppose because I think that when people hear things like, truth is about interrelations between thoughts, I think that immediately people will think that means that it's kind of in your conscious control. So I think it might be worth, I suppose one, I occasionally use the distinction from Hasok Chang, who you also know, the distinction between something being mind-framed and mind-controlled. And mind-framed is, interpreted, unavoidably seen from your own perspective. Like in the way that everything is seen from a perspective, not in kind of scary relativist way, just in a perfectly ordinary way whereby I am the person looking at this laptop. And I'm a human person looking at this laptop, so I'm not seeing any of the ultraviolet stuff that might be going on. I'm interpreting it in a way that's limited by my human cognitive capacities, and that's all true. But none of that means that I can suddenly think really hard and picture an elephant. It's not like that. There is stuff that I unavoidably butt up against. And I think that kind of, in a lot of ways, helps make this seem less for want of a better term, wooey. Because I think that when people think about ideas and idealism, I think it's partly like a terminological confusion. Like when somebody thinks of idealism, they think of ideas, and I can actually control my ideas quite, that they're in my kind of immediate volition, in a way that my experience clearly isn't. I think an interesting one question I suppose I'd have regarding Bradley's view is that I suppose I'm a little bit concerned that this kind of butting up against the real, the kind of inexpressible real, falls a little bit close, and it may be just I've misinterpreted it, to the kind of the given. This idea of it seems like my reality, when I view things, it doesn't seem like there's a stage whereby it's not cut up and then it's cut up by the time it, at some later point. I'm trying it now. I'm really struggling to perceive reality without the kind of immediate categorization. Even I had a neuroscientist on the other day. We even need to learn how to perceive edges. That's a thing that our brain does very, very young. And now, I'm looking at the way I film in a corner. So I'm looking at the edge where one wall meets the other, and I literally can't I can't get beyond that categorization. Is it that, does Bradley think that we can in some way, or is he happy to say no? There's an unavoidable level of chopped upness, and we just kind of get as close to unchopped upness in certain experiences as we can.
Okay, great. I'll answer that in 1 minute because there's a really good answer. So, yeah, you mentioned Hasok Chang. I think that's a really important point to drive home because it's also part of Russell's mischaracterization. So Hasok Chang has the notion of operational coherence. And that's not mere coherence. It has to be a coherence that is manifest. Also, our thinking or our theories cohere with the success or failure of our various operations. So I think there is something like that going on with truth, that your idea, it's not like Russell, who seems to think we could artificially construct a world where we start with a falsehood. In his case, Bishop Stubbs was hanged for murder. And then we just build a whole possible world of sentences that interact that could all be coherent. But what's missing? There's not that doesn't make it actual. Well, Hasok Chang's answer is, well, you could have that, but that won't operationally cohere. When you try to act on it in the world, you'll find that it's not successful, and that undermines, and you'll need to reevaluate it. For Bradley, there is that. That's the way in which our thinking connects with our volition and our action. So he's pragmatist in that sense, but he also wants to say it doesn't engage with might not engage with the felt encounter with reality either. And he also links that with, it might also not work with our intellectual satisfaction. But I won't talk about too much more to do with that. So he has a view along the lines of a pragmatism plus conception. So yeah, it's not weird. It doesn't allow you to just think whatever you want and it just comes out true. Okay, then your other question was, do we ever have access to this raw, unstructured nature of reality? So whether we have at any point in our past had access to it in that form, I think is an open question, as you've mentioned. It seems that very young infants, certain forms of animals, and so on might not have a lot of the distinctions that we take for granted. Subject, object, this and that, here and there, me, my environment, all of these fundamental categories, space and time, causation, which are ways in which we structure and interpret our experience. Maybe we had a time when we did encounter the world in the raw, but we would never have been able to be conscious of the fact that we engaged the world in the raw because we weren't able to reflect on it. As soon as you can reflect on your experience, you set up the experience I'm thinking about and the thinking of the thinking, right? So now we're capable of reflecting. Now we're capable of structuring and organizing and thinking back on those experiences. Now I'm metacognitive. No, we don't experience the world in its precognitive state, in the raw. And Bradley admits that. He says that the felt reality is never anything I encounter in thought or in judgment, but it remains throughout as the foundation of my thinking life. So when I then experience a red rose, an uncreative example, I'm not actually experiencing the redness that I then say, oh, that's the same color as the tomatoes in my garden, because the redness won't be an exact match. The feeling isn't identical, but I am abstracting an element of that and I'm using it to model something else, or I'm applying it elsewhere. But what I'm saying of the tomato is still related to my raw felt experience of redness, but not redness with sharp boundaries. Now, here's the thing. Bradley doesn't think that reality is as we feel it. He doesn't think reality is of a sort that doesn't have structure. Because this is where his third form of experience comes in, which I haven't mentioned yet, which is the absolute. In the absolute, feeling unbounded, so that would be every feeling, every experience, and felt experience of every human org, any kind of consciousness, unites with a fully thought out structural understanding and a fully complete moral and history of volition and acting at the end of all time. They must, he thinks, come together as in the absolute. The absolute is the only place where we actually attain truth, goodness, and beauty. So we, in our ways of trying to understand truth, unite what we've felt so far, cohering with how we're thinking and so on. Because that's our truth, we recognize that we're trying to describe the world in ever greater detail, in ever greater understanding of the relationships between this thing and that thing, mapping it all out. There must be an endpoint to that where we attain complete truth, but complete truth would no longer be able to be thought by itself. Thought would have to merge with feeling, the what reunite with the that, and it would be what he says, thought's happy suicide. Thought is kind of now reunited with feeling and volition in this whole. He's very optimistic. And that's his more mystical side. But you can see why he's led there through a series of quite rigorous, sort of, I think, quite grounded.
So is the absolute then, because I'm thinking here of like C.S. Peirce, for example, the idea of the true or truth for him being just like the perfect theory, in effect, like the end when we would all stop inquiring and saying, right, nothing more to find out. Our theory predicts everything. It does everything we want us to do. It engages with the world perfectly. And, it's sort of, I can't remember his exact wording, but because he changes his mind and everything. I wish C.S. Peirce wrote one book as opposed to like a series of articles scattered across 30 odd years. But like, I remember in one of the articles, he says, I don't necessarily believe that we'll get there or that this exists in any kind of thick sense. But nonetheless, it's like a regulative ideal. It's like the thing that it's asymptotic. We're trying to get there. We'll never quite get there. But the point is that we need to get close. Is Bradley thinking of the absolute along those lines, or is he suggesting that no, like the absolute is the thing that we're trying to get at, and it does exist and it's out there, but we'll just we might get there someday, or maybe we won't, because it seems to me that Peirce remains quite agnostic about his perfect theory kind of truth. Or end of inquiry kind of truth. How agnostic is Bradley about the absolute, or is he quite sure that this exists?
Fantastic question. And that is, there's a bit of a back and forth between Bradley and James on exactly this concern. So, no, Bradley's not agnostic about the absolute at all. And here's a couple of reasons why. So, firstly, for Peirce, although you can correct me on this, the end of inquiry is still the idea of this sort of fully settled theory. A fully settled understanding or scientific explanation for everything. Bradley would say that is impossible in principle because it would have to be more than a thought. Thought has to become transformed in its nature to be something that is more than thought. It's not non-thought, it's thought plus. Thought in its fully articulable way. So he says that it must therefore become reality itself for it to be complete. So on the one hand, he agrees with Peirce, no, we can't get there, because thought itself could never transcend its own nature. However, the normativity of thought that's driving us to that truth is being called forth from that, what you're calling the asymptote, or what would be the completion or the fullness, which is where Bradley's extreme monism comes in, the whole which is now complete. Now, Bradley says, because we recognize we're aiming toward that's the normative drive in our thinking. Truth. In the same way, beauty is a normative drive and feeling, and goodness and volition, but let's not worry about those. That means we are in that pursuit recognizing that is more real than our partial understanding right now. That if we could get there, then our understanding would have found its fulfillment. It would have achieved what it set out to achieve. So we are recognizing its reality. And that's linked with Bradley's slightly broader notion of what faith is. So he's not just got a religious notion of faith. He's got the idea of faith being the only way in which we can make sense of any human activity at all. It combines the normative with the recognition that there is something at the end of this road. We are heading towards something, but that thing is calling us forth, assuring us of the possibility of success, and also by recognizing its reality, recognizing that we're not there yet, the ways in which we are still so riddled with uncertainty, still so riddled with falsity and error, and we're being drawn then by this deepest sense of reality to genuinely understand, to genuinely be moral, and to genuinely experience this beauty. So it is quite religious, but not dressed up in the kind of typical religious doctrines. For him, it's the only way we can kind of make sense in a satisfactory way the very pursuit of truth and thinking and understanding as well.
So I suppose perhaps to give a kind of a structurally similar but significantly more down-to-earth example, maybe it could be like, is it sort of an extreme version of, say, I've got a friend working on general relativity. He's working with a quantum physicist, looking at little kind of minor problems, kind of small parts of the idea of being able to unify them, or I don't understand it. It's all very, very complicated. But like, for example, in their work, at least in a kind of operational sense, while they're performing their work, they at the very least are dispositionally having to believe that a solution is possible, or else the action no longer makes sense. When Bradley talks about the absolute, is that just like that times 1,000? This idea of like that, it's the thing we're taking on faith when we think of any kind of I'm thinking about intellectual progress, but I assume that he would also say aesthetic progress and moral progress.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's the idea that you can't make sense. If you're searching for the Holy Grail, you have to at least assume that it exists, even if you're unsure. The very practice of it is one that posits it is there to discover. I mean, we have this come up in different areas in philosophy. The principle of sufficient reason just assumes that the world is intelligible, and it assumes the world is intelligible so as to motivate the attempt to understand it.
Mm.
And so we kind of assume that there is a world out there that is fortuitously set up such that we can know it. And I suppose if you're an idealist, then you're coming at things from that point of view. You're not anchoring everything so much in this idea of there being some independent being of how things really are out there. So you don't have this correspondence view of truth where there just are facts out there that we have to somehow figure out. You're recognizing the way in which everything that we do is relational. It's between us and the world. The knower and the known are somehow together. The process of knowing affects that which is known, and so on. So within this entire interactive way of interpreting everything, then if there's movement in a direction, it seems to be headed somewhere. I mean, you might think we'd never get there, but I guess it's the draw for Bradley is the only way of making sense of what being ultimately is. He hasn't got this separate notion of being entirely divorced from our experiences. And so in a kind of a naturalistic physicalist way, we assume, there's all these things out there that might not even in principle be knowable, or might be completely disconnected from us. But that's really hard to make sense. Bradley would only make sense of that in terms of, we might think it, but not have felt it yet. It's still part of our experience, right? So his notion of reality is tied with this notion of what's drawing on us. And so I think that's why he would posit in fact, if he said the absolute didn't exist, it's merely a fiction or something like that, I think he'd say that's not taking it seriously enough. That is, you're directing your entire life around this thing, and then you're just saying it's not real. What then is real, right? Surely what's real must be that which draws us most powerfully. So he says at one point, in the end, we must abandon the idea there is any distinction between truth and knowledge and being and reality. So at the end, these things will have to come together somehow.
Okay. I'll definitely have to ponder that a little bit more. I'll have to go and read Appearance and Reality. I read I read the introduction to it. Something that struck me is because I'm a pragmatist, I'm always looking for little pragmatist themes in other thinkers. And so one of my favorites is Descartes saying, cogito ergo sum is indubitable, which is a very interesting thing to say rather than true. It's very, very pragmatist. The other the thing that I thought was very interesting was something we touched upon very earlier was Bradley's idea that you have different metaphysics for different times. That I thought that was incredibly interesting, right? It's but partly because I was talking to arch naturalist Walter Weiss, who gave this idea of synthetic philosophy. He talks about philosophy as a way of bringing together lots of results from natural science and trying to kind of unify them into a sensible picture of the world that we can understand. Because and I remember thinking, reading Bradley, I remember thinking, God, there's not too dissimilar in this kind of synthetic idea of philosophy. Because historically, I've been very skeptical of metaphysics generally, but more recently, I've been thinking about the way in which viewing metaphysics as, well, we all have a way of understanding reality, whether we want to or not, because it's just how we unify different things we've heard, different things we think we know together into a picture of the world, more or less successfully. And that's going to affect how we then approach the world and do further investigations. And I was thinking, well, I don't know, maybe if I'm to be a proper pragmatist, which is ostensibly what I believe, then that is a pragmatic consequence of certain metaphysical positions. Now, thinking about them, the my director of studies was Milena Ivanova, and she talks about aesthetics in science. And I remember reading one of her articles and thinking, talking about the kind of, it might have been one of her articles, might have been someone else, and talking about the different pictures of metaphysics that emerged at the early 20th century regarding physics and how they influence the sheer practice of scientific theorizing. And then that made me think, oh no, maybe I've jumped the gun a bit here. But anyway, Bradley, very, very interesting. And to the final question, just to wrap us up, because you've been incredibly generous with your time. What's the most interesting idea you've come across in the past year, and why?
Wow. Okay. I think, I don't know if it's in the last year, but I think that the quote that I said to you before about Occam's razor was such an aha moment, which is that the theory that you have is geared towards what it is you are seeking. Collingwood puts this in terms of philosophical positions are always answers to questions. You mentioned Descartes. Descartes' conclusion, cogito ergo sum, can't really be understood apart from his method and what he's looking for. Mm-hmm. And what I think that does is, and maybe this is the pragmatist insight that you're talking about as well, that actually, when we think we are aiming at something, we're trying to do something. And so there doesn't seem to me to be a bigger philosophical sin than that reductive impulse that says, this is my theory and that is all there is. End of story. That's all, folks. Any of those sorts of claims I now think are faith positions of the worst kind, and it pops up everywhere, right? Even sort of Quine with his taste for desert landscapes, all this sort of saying no to such fundamental aspects, and that to me suddenly meant philosophy changed. It became much more exploratory, became much more the sorts of things, as you say, Bradley puts. If you have a drive within you to try to understand everything, you should do it properly. You should do it unashamedly. Don't let people tell you it's pointless and worthless. You're going to do it anyway. So do it to the full of your ability and try to account for everything. So I guess it's a bit of a longer answer, but I think that this sort of highly reductive, highly deny things that you can't make sense of. It comes out in Occam's razor. It comes out in the idea that reality is just thought. All of that, I think, got released, and it gave space for not free for all, as Russell thought it was, not mystery that we can't say anything about, but a recognition that what we are doing is trying to reach towards something in a clear, rigorous way that is ultimately unreachable. And then that's why philosophy keeps going. And so will science.
Fantastic. I think that does touch on the tension between being too reductive and letting too many things in. I think it fascinates me, because I'm not like a big fan of like scientism myself, but I think that one important challenge leveled to the rest of inquiry by scientism is you've got to have some kind of standard. You can't let anything through the gate, which is the question of, I think that's effectively the impulse that seems to have motivated people like those in the Vienna Circle, right? Is that like we can't let too many things in. We've got to have standards, which I agree with. But then like picking those standards is incredibly difficult. I think the kind of pragmatic maxim is the one they lean towards at the moment, but it's such a hard problem. As I say, because you don't want to free for all, but you don't want to be too reductive either.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to be said for pragmatism. Maybe at some point there's a whole series of essays that Bradley directs at William James in Essays on Truth and Reality, which I haven't read yet, so I wouldn't talk to you about it. But he prefaces it by saying, basically, don't treat all of these things as evidence that I am that much different to William James. The reason I'm having to write so much about it is because I am so similar to much of what's coming out of pragmatism, but the differences are very important, and I need to make them clear and justify my position. So when I understand that a bit more, some of it is this idea that William James is happy to say there's just the urges that we feel in this discovering truth. There's just the urge for satisfaction. There's just the urge for truth and morality and so on. That doesn't mean there's something urging us. Right? Saying, no, there must be something ultimate reality urging us. That does seem
Mm.
to be some of the disagreement. So I'm interested to look further at it. But
I'll have to look at it as well.
Pragmatism way ahead of the.
It does seem, a lot of the work of Cheryl Mizak has been charting the lineage of pragmatism through empiricism and naturalism. Maybe there's a similar either genealogical or just kind of comparative study to be done on pragmatism and forms of idealism, because I mean it just seems to, there just seem to be a lot of I mean, I think in many ways it's, I mean, I would say this because I'm just a pragmatist propagandist, but in many ways I see it as the middle path, the middle path there. But anyway, thanks so much for coming on. This has been a real pleasure.